Hey people, welcome to the Run Testers. Kieran here, and today we're going to be comparing these three watches. They're all from Polar. We've got the new Vantage V2, we've got the Polar Grit X, and we've got the original V. We're going to help you decide which one you should buy. So if you're considering upgrading from the original V, or you're wondering whether or not the extra £70 that you'll pay for the V2 is worth it over the very recently launched Grit X, this is the video for you. You're going to find out right here. We're going to take you through everything you need to know. We've tested the heart rate, we've tested the GPS, we've tested the design, the durability, all of those things, and we're going to compare them all across three watches so that you can make an informed choice. If you're going for a Polar, which one of these will suit you best? So take a look. So the Polar Vantage V2 is Polar's new flagship watch. It follows hot on the heels of the slightly more outdoorsy Grit X. It's the upgrade to the V, and it's aimed squarely at people who are really quite serious about getting deep into their kind of tracking insights for performance and post-performance with recovery, sleep, and all of that jazz. So quick highlights. The V2 offers everything that you'll get on the Polar Grit X and more. The Vantage V2 GPS battery life is 40 hours. That's exactly in line with the Grit X and the Polar Vantage V, so no difference there. They're all the same. But you'll get an extendable low GPS battery life up to 100 hours, which you only find on the Grit X, not the Vantage V. Recovery Pro, running performance, cycling and leg recovery tests, new tests that we'll go into later, are only on the V2. You can't get them on the Grit X or the Vantage V. Route planning and turn-by-turn navigation, some of it powered by Komoot, is across all three of the watches, so there's no difference there. Weather, which is missing on the original V, is on the Grit X and it's on the V2. If you're bothered about weight, the V2 actually is the lightest of all the three watches. It comes in at 52 grams versus the Vantage V 66 grams and 64 on the Grit X. Now then there's the important price. UK prices here. The V2 RRP is £10 more expensive than the V. It's £449 versus £439 for the original V at its original sales price. And it's £70 more expensive than the Grit X, which comes in at £379. So when it comes to design, the V2, as you can see, it looks a lot like the original V, although it's slightly sleeker and a little bit more refined. You've got this kind of one-piece, almost one-piece, kind of sleek aluminium alloy and reinforced glass fiber polymer casing that's a little smoother. It's a little bit more refined, a little bit more pleasing on the eye. It's also one of the lightest watches that you'll find in this kind of premium multi-sport watch kind of tier bracket. It comes in at 52 grams. That is 14 grams lighter than the first generation V. It's dropped from 66 grams down to 52. It's also 12 grams lighter than the Grit X, and it comes in a whopping 83 grams lighter than something like the Garmin Fenix 6 Pro. So the V2 also has a slightly smoother swappable silicone strap that makes it marginally more comfortable than the Grit X and the original V. That's really important actually for making that slight additional sort of comfort for all day wear on the wrist. It's kind of important for making the most out of all of the recovery, nightly recharge, sleep tracking, all of that you get with the Polar Vantage V2. So we kind of welcome that slight improvement. It's a little bit more smooth and a little bit more comfortable on the wrist. There's interchangeable straps that you can buy extra from Polar, and we've tested it with the normal straps. Now, one of the key design differences really between the V2 and the Grit is really if you're looking for something that's got a little bit more of a rugged kind of outdoorsy, sporty style and feel, then the Grit X moves more towards that kind of area of something like a Garmin Fenix 6. It actually is quite like the Garmin Forerunner 945. It's not all the way along into those big chunky Sunto Garmin Fenix style watches, but the Grit X does take you a little bit more in that direction. So if that's important, maybe that's one of the things that would be a selling point for you to get the Grit X over the V2. But in terms of durability, actually on paper, they all claim to have the same level of durability, military grade kind of testing that makes the Grit X, the V and the V2 equal on that footing. So the only other major difference here in durability terms is the fact that the V2 has 100 meters water resistance, the same as the Grit X, whereas the original Vantage V only had 50 meters protection. So the V2's 47mm case is 1mm bigger than on the V and on the Grit X, but it's barely noticeable. You can't really see it on the wrist or feel it. Inside of that, you've got the same 1.2 inch 240 by 240 pixel resolution color touchscreen display. So those things are pretty much even across all three. But there is one difference. One thing you get on the V2 that you don't get on the Grit X or the V is an ambient light sensor in that display which responds to the light conditions around you and adjusts the screen brightness to fit. And in our test, that actually sort of means that we found the V2 often to be a little bit easier to read and a little bit brighter in most light conditions certainly up against the V and also slightly up against the Grit X. So that's an improvement there on the V2. Another major improvement that we found are the 5 control buttons that you've got on the side here are now really much more responsive than we found on the original V, which was really stiff and one of the worst things about that watch. They're even, I think, more tactile, more responsive than you get on the Grit X2. So that's a vast improvement with the V2, something we really welcome. The somewhat laggy touchscreen that we found on the V, I think, although Mike has had some different experiences, I think is also better. I think it's a little bit more responsive. It's still not kind of as slick and swift as an Apple Watch, but actually even doing this now, you can see the screen scroll through. On the V, this would have lagged. It wouldn't have worked on the swipe, and definitely on the tap as well, it actually does what you want more quickly. So those upgraded controls are definitely an improvement on the V, and I think I'd put them marginally ahead of the Grit X2. So when it comes to the features, the V2 arguably has more in common with the Grit X than it does with the original Vantage V. Like, in fact, they're so similar that we'd probably argue that Polar could have just made one watch here. Apart from that sort of slightly more rugged build, there's only a few things that are different on the V2 than on the Grit X. And actually, you've got to say, could they have just put out one watch and saved the environment a little bit? And also just saved a lot of people spending on the Grit when they probably want some of the features that come on the V2. And I think we'd all agree here at the Run Testers that this is a bit of a challenge that Coros are setting, where they're rolling back features down to their earlier watches and devices to make it a little bit more easy to not have to upgrade. And in a world where, I'm going to get my environmental hat on now, in a world where we've kind of got short on resources, do we need to really be looking at the ways we can make people keep hold of hardware longer, provided the hardware and the sensors do the jobs that are required to run the software? I would argue that actually we probably want to stop people buying as many watches, but that really is just my little bit of a sustainable high horse. I mean, the truth here is if you've just bought the Grit X and you see the V2 come out with a few new features, you're going to be pretty miffed that you're not getting those features. Now, I mean, here's the thing. Why not, if the hardware exists in the watches to run all those software features, offer people the chance to keep hold of their old watch and even pay a little bit more to upgrade as you go, rather than having to replace the hardware, send your other watch back into landfill somewhere, taken from the planet, taken from the environment, and also taken from your pocket. Make it easier for us, Polar and Garmin. Let's get together and do this. We can actually make people have far better watches without you guys having to lose necessarily any money. Maybe a subscription model further down the line, who knows? Anyway, that's a sidetrack. So rant over, back to the features. So the V2 has everything that you'll get on the original V. So the things that you didn't get on the Grit X that are on the V that were important, like Recovery Pro, is on the V2 as you'd expect. What you're also getting there though on the V2 is all the new features that came on the Grit X that you didn't get rolled back to the original V. So that means things like Hill Splitter, which offers automatic breakdown of your climbs and descents when you're running. So on the V2, you're also now going to get fuel-wise fueling recommendations that help you understand how much and how often to eat during longer endurance events based on your heart rate. That's a nice addition to the V2 that we saw on the Grit X as well that you didn't get on the V. And as we mentioned earlier, Komoot-powered route planning and turn-by-turn navigation now comes to all three, so you're getting that on the V2 as well. So where do these things start to diverge? Well, one big thing that's coming on the V2 that's not on the other watches are the new tests. There is a running performance, a cycling performance, and a leg recovery test that you're only going to get on the V2. It won't be rolled back down. The running performance test is essentially mimicking a kind of a lab maximal effort test where you can work out what your VO2 max is. You can also look at things like setting your aerobic threshold zones and also recalibrating your max heart rate and your heart rate zones. Once you've done that watch guided test, if you want to, you can automatically update all of the zone settings for things like speed, for heart rate, and for power on the watch itself, making it easier then to guide your future training. You won't be getting that on the Grit X or the V. Polar told us there's no plans to roll those back. You're also getting the leg recovery test, which is basically like a simple jump test where you do 3 jumps and the height of your jump each time is used to calculate really whether or not you're fully recovered on a muscular level. It's the first time on any watch that we've seen the ability to look at muscular recovery rather than cardio recovery. That's on the V2, it's not on the other watches, no plans to roll that down either. So beyond those key differences, you can expect exactly the same run performance tracking across all 3 devices. And that means things like running power from the wrist, VO2 max estimates. It means there is the running index score. You can get there's a regular fitness test, Strava live segments. All of that is exactly the same across all the 3 watches. So beyond the run, you're also going to get nightly recharge across all 3. You're going to get sleep stages plus sleep tracking. You're going to get Also the FitSpark workout recommendations, those recovery linked workout recommendations with guided kind of workouts on the wrist that are really good. They work on how well you've bounced back overnight, and you're also going to get things like this sort of serene breathing exercise. So all of those sort of holistic tools outside of running are the same across all three. So another big deciding factor for a lot of people will be the heart rate accuracy. And actually when it comes down to it, between the Grit X, the V2 and the V, there isn't really much to choose when we're talking about that optical heart rate sensor. They pretty much behave kind of on a par. The Grit X and the V2 are both kind of prone to a little bit of spiking and some high reads versus the H10 chest strap in our tests. But overall, really, in order to get the most out of any of these watches, you're really going to want to put on a chest strap to get the most out of those training insights and even those kind of all those recovery features and such like. So this isn't really something that we would say is a deciding factor when it comes to choosing between the three. So then, the satellite system support across all three watches is identical. You're getting GPS, GLONASS, you're getting Galileo and QZ-SS. And they've all got assisted GPS, which is Polar's kind of trick to get you a faster and more accurate kind of first fix. It's supposed to be speedier. We didn't really find any difference between the three of them when we took them out on tests. They were all there or thereabouts within sort of 15 or 20 seconds. That's as quick as any other watch we've found. So you get a compass on the V2 and the Grit X, but not on the V1. And all three offer that Komoot route planning and turn-by-turn navigation. You can also load routes from other sources. So if you've run a run using another watch, you've dragged it down from Strava onto all three devices via the Polar Flow web tools. Those things are exactly the same across all three. And there's back to start on all three to help you kind of retrace your steps should you be out there and sort of get lost, or you just want to head straight back home. That's a really nifty feature, but again, it's on all three, so no difference there. So now on to GPS accuracy. And if you haven't watched our video on what affects GPS accuracy and how those things can all vary really wildly, you really should, because it's really insightful. Check that out. But in sort of full power GPS mode, all of these watches pretty much performed on a similar level up against our Stride running foot pod. They were, within a happy margin of error, to be honest, and performed fairly consistently. It was really when we hit low power GPS mode that things started to change. So in the low power mode, it was actually the Grit X that performed the best. The V2, not so much. We had one marathon test. It was a trail marathon, up and down a coastal trail marathon. So we're dipping down and rising, and it clocked an extra 7 miles up against a Garmin Fenix 6 Pro in full power GPS and another Garmin in full power GPS, and that is a huge chunk. And even at low power mode, you'd expect it to be far better than that. If you're running an ultra, adding 7 miles like that is a real mind melter, and that is not the kind of performance that we would want from it. So very disappointed there with the Polar Vantage V2. It almost makes that low power, or the full low power mode where you're supposed to get 100 hours battery life, almost unusable. At least it did in our test. So by contrast, actually, the Grit X in low power mode in our test, we did it over a 45-mile ultra, and the variation with that up against the Garmin Fenix 6 Pro was very little. So the Grit X in low power mode, at least on the occasions that we've tested it, seemed to be a little bit more reliable. So another big selling point of the V2 is that it now comes with bigger battery. It has the same 40-hour full GPS runtime as the V1 and the Grit X, but crucially over the original V, it now comes with an extender power mode, which lets you kind of pulse the GPS satellites less frequently and extend that battery life up to 100 hours. For general usage and smartwatch mode, all of them offer 7 days on paper. Now in our test, we found some really sort of big discrepancies here. In normal GPS power mode, our V2 clocked around 25 hours runtime off a single charge, and it really only squeezed out around kind of 30 to 35 hours in that low power GPS mode. That is hugely off the 100-hour mark. And we obviously didn't run for 100 hours with it. We tested it over a 6.5 hour trail run, and if we scale that up, what we got out of that performance, it only kind of scales up to around sort of 35 hours max. That is way down. And also, as we mentioned, the accuracy of the GPS on that was also a bit out of question. So that kind of raises big questions for us about whether or not that extender mode is really a valuable feature over the V for the V2. It seems to be quite questionable. So when it came to our tests kind of with a normal week of running, there was a difference in performance here too. So the V2, the most we squeezed out of that with 6 hours of running was around 5 days tops. The V2 managed to squeeze out around 6 days with the same amount of running. The Grit X, however, once we'd done a factory reset, performed far better. And actually, we got beyond the 7 days that Polar claims on paper with the same amount of running in there. So in terms of the overall kind of daily regular usage as you might use it for training, the Grit X sort of comes out on top when it comes to battery life. When it comes to runtime in full GPS mode as well, the Grit X got closer to the 40 hours mark and outperformed the V2 as well. On that kind of 100-hour low power battery mode, both of them really struggled. The Grit X and the V2 both struggled to get near that 100-hour mark, but the Grit X was kind of slightly better at that too. So overall battery life, I think the Grit X outperforms. One thing to say here, that even with the battery performance in the low power mode not being quite what it is on paper, it's still better than what you'll find on the Vantage V. So we'll be quick with the smartwatch features because Polar really isn't about smartwatch features, let's face it, it's quite limited. They're not really like, Garmin has gone a little bit further down this road and it's certainly nowhere near anything like an Apple Watch. So what you'll get across all three watches are smartphone notifications, read-only, popping up on your watch, that's fine. The Grit X and the V2 are the only ones that offer a 3-day weather forecast, which is quite handy. You need to pair it with the phone to update that weather forecast with the Polar Flow app. But that's pretty good. And only the Vantage V2 now comes with music controls, so you can control things like Spotify, Deezer, and all of your other kind of media apps on your phone. You will need to carry your phone with you. It's a nice little addition from Polar, but it basically just brings it in line with a lot of other watches that have already been offering this for a long time. So let's talk about the price then. Well, the V2 is the most expensive of the lot. It comes in at £449 in the UK. It's just under $500 in the US, and that is actually the same price in the US as the original list price for the Vantage V. The original UK list price for the Vantage V was actually $439. So the Vantage V2 is actually £10 more expensive in the UK than it was. That's not the case in the US. Don't really know why that is the case. The Grit X is actually £70 cheaper in the UK, and that is actually $429.95 in the US. So there's a difference there between the Grit X and the new V2. What we should say actually is that if you look around now, that the original V is coming in much cheaper than the list price. You can actually pick it up for around £350 if you look carefully here in the UK. And we're going to expect to see more bargains coming in for the V in the future. So that verdict then, well, the V, the Vantage V2 and the Grit X are all good running watches at the price. Here's how you're going to have to decide between them though. Basically, you could choose the Vantage V2 if you want all the features Polar has to offer in a nice, sleek, lightweight design. It's undoubtedly a decent improvement on the original V. And if you're looking at these two coming in at their list prices, so that's paying full price for both of them, it's a no-brainer that you're going to want to buy the Vantage V2. The buttons are more responsive. The screen is brighter in all conditions. The battery life is on a par or better. And actually, overall, it's just a better watch all round. So the V2 if you're going full price. However, you might want to choose the original Vantage V if you can find it for a knockdown price. And we'd say if you can find it sub 350, this might be a bargain. So if you were to go for that knockdown original V for much less money, you're also going to be sacrificing things like those running performance tests, the leg recovery test. You're not going to have any of the really sort of clever hill-wise, fuel-wise features that came along with the Grit X originally and now on the V2 as well. So there is going to be a difference, quite a stark difference in the feature set. But if you can get it for under £350, maybe, there's enough on the V to make it an interesting watch for some people at a certain level. So don't completely discount it. So why are you going to choose the Grit X? Well, it's a much less clear-cut decision versus the V2. If you're not too bothered about the new running and cycling performance tests and that leg recovery test, and you don't really care about Recovery Pro, you're happy to have your recovery done by the kind of automatic nightly recharge, and you don't want to do the orthostatic tests that look a little bit deeper into your HRV with a more accurate chest strap, and you're not bothered really about music controls, then you can definitely save yourself 70 quid by investing in the Grit X. It's a good watch, slightly more rugged look, style to it, but if all of those things come into a package, you can save yourself 70 quid and still get a decent watch. So the other thing that you're going to get with the Grit X in our tests is actually a little bit of a better battery life. So for £70 less, you're going to get a watch that has more runtime in it too. So that's another consideration to take into account here. So there you have it. If you want the all singing, all dancing, and you've got the money to pay for it, then the Polar Vantage V2 is definitely going to be your best bet. If you don't mind a rugged appearance, or you're looking for a rugged appearance and you want to save yourself a bit of money, don't care about music controls and Recovery Pro, then the Grit X is something that's very much worth looking at, particularly because the battery life is a little bit better. If actually you're happy with a lower set of features and you don't mind kind of wrestling a little bit with a less responsive touchscreen and some sort of slightly stiffer buttons, then actually the Vantage V might be a bargain watch that you could look at too. So that's it, that's our comparison of the Polar Vantage V2, the original V and the more recent Grit X. If we've missed anything and you have any questions, feel free to ask us in the comments. If you've had experience with these watches and you want to tell us something you loved, something you hated, something you think we've gotten wrong, then also whack us a comment down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe and ring the bell to hear when we've got more reviews coming up in the not too distant future with watches, shoes, everything. And we're also going to be launching our Christmas gift list. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you again soon.